Let me go live here for those that watch. I don't know. Oh, I got 3 waiting. 3 people. All right. Do you? Well, that's good.
On the big TV. I can see your high definition.
You can see the little white and gray in between on the hairs. I don't even know how far we got last time.
Oh, yeah.
1 Kings. I think we got to chapter 10. Which is Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. I know when we looked at chapter 9, I remember talking about God's warning to Solomon. There's a level of faithfulness that God expects. Imagine that, God having expectations of us. Most evangelical Christians don't like the idea that God may have expectations, because that means somehow or another that we're supposed to be responsible for ourselves rather than just totally relying on the salvation that God offers us. And we do that because we want to believe that, we're helpless in our salvation, so God freely gives it. And when He offers it and we receive it, then there's nothing to add to that. That's it. So that kind of thinking leads us to a conclusion that, well, then the Spirit really isn't necessary, because the Spirit allows for us to have the kind of life that honors God. But if we don't have any responsibility in that, then we never really seek the Spirit as He is working in our life. And after a period of time, we get what most Christians really struggle with if they really think about their faith is, what's this really all about? Is it worth it? Is this really something in my life? Or they're happy that they don't have to worry, and so they just live their life however they want. So God, when He brings His children Israel out of bondage, He tells them the same thing. I'm going to be your God if you continue to be this kind of people with me. But when you don't, it's not going to be good, because there's a relationship that's building here. And your behavior, your activity in it, who you are, the character that you have in it matters to me. Which for me makes, what I would think that would, most people would find that very pleasing. That you have a way in which you can show again to God who He is, show but give back. And so in this passage in 9, God tells, and I know we went over this and we'll do it again. God or Adonai gives Solomon a promise and a warning. And that's what I've been talking about. After Solomon finished building the Lord's temple, the royal palace, and all the other construction projects he had planned, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time. Now this is some 17 years later than the first time that He appears. During the interim, He has built the temple, He's done all these things. And so now it is as if everything's in place and God needs to remind Solomon. He's been busy about bringing earthly glory and honor to God. And once that project is over, God is saying to him again, there's more to this. What happens in that temple, the whole sacrificial system, is important to me, but it is not the end all from you to me. There's more that's involved. The Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, and in the same way He had appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have answered your prayer and your request for help that you made to me. So notice, Solomon asked, God responds favorably. Solomon acts favorably, and now God is reminding him of that, the series of events that has occurred. I have consecrated the temple you built by making it my permanent home. So you asked for it, I granted it, and now I've in a very real way endorsed this whole project that you and I have been a part of, because my name dwells there. I will be constantly present there. Meaning this is where heaven and earth meets, and I'm not going to forsake that. You must serve me with integrity and sincerity, just as your father David did. So for David and all of his faults, all the outward things that were going on, all the trouble that his life brought about, God is able to say that David had a level of integrity in our relationship that I value to this day. So we have to look at where would that come from? The Psalms give us the best picture. Give us a look into the heart of David and his relationship with God. And now what God is saying is, Solomon, I want that very same thing with you, just as I had with your father. Do everything I commanded and obey my rules and regulations. That's the way the Net Bible describes that. The Hebrew actually says, as for you, if you walk before me as your David father walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, by doing all which I commanded you, and you keep my rules and regulations. It's a conditional clause. Okay, the whole thing is a conditional clause. You've got to do some things in order for me to maintain the integrity that I have in the relationship. So God is saying, I'm not going to keep a relationship with someone who doesn't want it. And the way that I know you want it is when you stand before me with integrity and sincerity. But if you don't, then it is right to assume that you don't want this relationship anymore. So we don't like hearing that on this side of the cross. But Jesus has a lot of conditional clauses that he offers when he's talking to his disciples. So we can, with great confidence, say that what God is requiring of Solomon, he also requires of us. It says, and I don't mean activity. I don't mean that we have to be perfect. I mean integrity and sincerity. Then I will allow your dynasty to rule over Israel permanently, just as I promised your father David. You will not fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But, one of the biggest buts in the Bible. It's funny, isn't it? I thought you might not like that. But if you or your sons ever turn away from me, fail to obey the regulations and rules I instructed you to keep, and decide to serve and worship other gods, then I will remove Israel from the land. So the integrity of the nation, the integrity of everything that God has done is dependent upon how they respond to God. He can give it and he can take it away. And he's letting them know that. I have given them, I will abandon this, then I will remove Israel from the land I have given them. I will abandon this temple I have consecrated with my presence, and Israel will be mocked and ridiculed among the nations. This temple will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by it will be shocked and will hiss out their scorn, saying, why did the Lord do this to this land and his temple? Others will then answer, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who led their ancestors out of Egypt. They embraced other gods and they worshipped and served. That is why the Lord has brought all this disaster down on them. So pretty powerful stuff, okay? So, and God is saying, I've consecrated this temple. I've made it my own, but I'll take that back. There's nothing here that matters to me more than your fidelity to me. And we show that fidelity to him. I mean, how do you show God that you're faithful and true to him? The only way to do it is to know what he says in here. This guidebook for being in relationship with him. And then we live that way. And so we strive to do that in our lives, even as Christians, because what God is stating here is no different than a covenant that he made with Abraham, that he made with David, that he made even with Noah, and that the cross makes with us. He offers himself to us. He forgives us of our sin. He calls us into a life of righteousness, and then provides us with a spirit that is able to allow for that to happen in our lives. And if we just ignore all of that, then really, what is it? Is it salvation? That would be the first question we would ask. Is this really real for you? So the fruit that we look for in this particular examination is, how is the nation of Israel led by the king? As the king goes, so the people go. So the fruit that God looks at is, boy, if the relationship is strong with me and the king, you'll see it in the nation. But if it's not strong, you're not going to see it in the nation. Terrible calamities are going to occur. In the New Testament, it's the fruit of our lives that is seen. And you'll be able to know God is saying, when you see these things in a person's life, you know that we have this active relationship. And heaven has met earth in that person's heart. And that person's life is reflecting all these good things back in the world because they're from me. They're not from them. Hence, the fruit of the Spirit. See? So it's the same thing, just in different circumstances, different realities, different time. And we're able to function as a king because God makes us that. We're prophet, priest, king in our lives. And so it's a great honor, great privilege, great all of that. That's all I got to say about that. We're going to run on. So the foreign affairs and the building projects that follow here kind of goes through this list of everything that Solomon builds, the help that King Hiram gives. We talked about that before. As a result, Solomon gives him 20 towns that are close to or border Tyre. Hiram's not too happy with the gift. They're kind of podunk towns. He thought he was going to get more, but we find later as we read on that they continue their business endeavors together, and Hiram becomes quite rich in the process of being an ally with David. So everything's okay. Here we find that Solomon conscripted slaves to do his work. Now, if we go back, we know that the Israelites were slaves, and they were relieved of their indenturedness by God, and brought them out, brought them to freedom, and even gave some instruction about the taking of slaves in Deuteronomy and Numbers. And now Solomon is creeping into some things that he shouldn't. The first was this. We'll see later that one of the other things he does is he amasses a great amount of wealth. And God warns about that in Deuteronomy. He says, don't seek wealth, seek me. He amasses a great number of chariots and horses, 12,000 horses to pull his chariots. And God warns in Deuteronomy, don't depend on military might. Don't depend on the chariots, because I'm your might. And then finally, the thing that he warns about that Solomon breaks is taking pagan wives into your home, because he knows, God knows, that a man can't resist a woman. She's got sway over him. And so if a pagan wife comes in, she's going to encourage the worship of pagan gods. And so he warns against these three things. Of course, we find out in chapter 11, which we may get to, that Solomon has a lot of pagan wives. Okay, not just a lot of chariots and a lot of money. In fact, they're so rich that silver was kind of like just rocks laying on the ground. Silver had no value. There was so much silver. The opposite. Y'all don't remember this. It happened in the early 80s. But the Hunt brothers, who were oil barons in Texas, decided they were going to corner the silver market. So much so to the point that they were called before Congress because no one knew what silver was worth. And at that time, it was used as a commodity for commerce. And they had bought up so much of the world's silver that no one knew how much they were worth, and no one knew how much silver was going to be worth. So they actually wound up they were pretty much ordered to unload their silver, because it was crazy that they were even able to do it, or even that they even thought of doing it. But anyway, this was the opposite. There was so much silver everywhere that it was worth nothing. So this is what he had. He had great wealth. The Pharaoh gave him a city that he was able to rebuild. And when we go through this list of towns and what he was doing, he's building fortified cities around Jerusalem. So if anybody ever attacks, they have to get through those cities before they get to the royal city. So it's not just that he's doing all this stuff just because he can, but because it's going to function to help provide security for the royalty and the holy city, because it was a holy city. That's the way they saw the city of David. So that's pretty much the rest of 1 Kings chapter 9. He began to expand into, but before he relied on Hiram for what he would do in the ocean, his trade back and forth across the seas. But by the time of chapter 9, the end of chapter 9, he's building his own fleet of ships. Okay, and he's figured out how to pretty much lease those to Hiram. And so they're in this great business operation going on and bringing in wealth from all over the world, the known world. Chapter 10. So when the Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon, she came to challenge him with difficult questions. So the first verse here, some translations will include, let me see exactly how it says it. They include that she was quizzing him because God had given him this great wisdom. The parallel of this in 2 Chronicles does not include the name Yahweh attached to Solomon's wisdom. But later on, they parallel nicely in the second part of this passage. So the Net Bible chooses to leave out and be consistent with the 2 Chronicles passage. So when the Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon, she came to challenge him with different questions. She arrived in Jerusalem with a great display of pomp, bringing with her camels, carrying spices, very large quantity of gold and precious gems. She visited Solomon and discussed with him everything that was on her mind. So when it uses that word pomp, it's talking about there had been nothing ever in Jerusalem like when the Queen of Sheba showed up. She just overwhelmed the whole city with how much wealth she brought and all the things that she brought. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was no question too complex for the king. When the Queen of Sheba saw for herself Solomon's extensive wisdom, the palace he had built, the food in his banquet hall, the servants and attendants, their robes, his cupbearers, his burnt offerings, which he presented in the Lord's temple, she was amazed. So the Hebrew here would say her breath was taken. The spirit was removed from her. I mean, she just is breathless in this thing that's going on. She can't believe. So here we have one of the things that perpetuates up until the time of the divided kingdom and ultimately exile was if God is present, He's blessing you. Okay, so heaven meets earth here because there's great wealth here. There's great everything here. Everybody's cared for here. All the good things of the earth are here. Okay, and she sees it that way. But she also says this. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your wise sayings and insight was true. I did not believe these things until I came and saw them with my own eyes. Indeed, I didn't even hear half the story. Your wisdom and wealth surpasses what was reported to me. Your attendants who stand before you at all times and hear your wise sayings are truly happy. May the Lord your God be praised because He favored you by placing you on the throne of Israel." So, what the writer interjects in the first verse is finally said down here where it belongs. She observes all that is happening with Solomon, all of his wisdom, all of his wealth, the court that he has before him. If you remember, it takes so much flour. The flour that they describe to feed the royal court, it would be about 35,000 people. So imagine that. Just try to imagine that somehow. There's a lot of activity, a lot of bustling going on, and we think of that period of time as being primitive, but quite an operation going on. 35,000 people. That would probably, if you went from here to our house, which is about 10 miles north of Walker, and took in all the people in that little area there, probably be about 35,000 people right now. Yeah. So she gives credit to God for all of this. The Lord, because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, He made you king. Okay? So she not only recognized what's going on as God's blessing upon Solomon, but this is God's eternal love for Israel. So this is a fascinating thing. A foreigner comes here. All she knows is about Solomon and his wealth. And she recognizes God's hesed, his enduring love, his, how does she say it? By placing love for Israel, He has made you king. So the word there is hesed, and we've talked about there before, this everlasting love that He has. So what God has done is really borne testimony to Himself, not only to Solomon. And He did this just so Solomon could make just and right decisions. So here we go. List all the things that she brought. 120 talents of gold, a very large quantity of spices and precious gems. The quantity of spices the Queen of Sheba gave King Solomon has never been matched. And then there's this little verses 11 and 12 kind of interjects this thing that Hiram has brought. So this is another way of just describing the great wealth that Solomon has, and that it comes from far and wide. And he really is living in peace, because here is a queen from a very powerful country that resides what would be where Kuwait is today. And there's no talk of trying to overthrow or attack or do any of those things. They're just marveled at God's blessing upon these people. With the timber, the king made supports for the Lord's temple and for the royal palace, and stringed instruments for musicians. No one has seen so much of this fine timber to this day. So that's an interjection there of what Hiram brought. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba everything she requested, besides what he had freely offered her. Then she left and returned to her homeland with her attendants. And then it goes on and describes more of Solomon's wealth. And I'm not going to go through all of those things. We get to 23. Verse 23 says, King Solomon was wealthier and wiser than any of the kings of the earth. Meaning that this was the wealthiest nation in the known world now. Everyone in the world wanted to visit Solomon to see him display his God-given wisdom. So not only are they recognizing the great material wealth, there still is standing before them this great wisdom that God is purveying through Solomon. Year after year, visitors brought their gifts, which included items of silver, items of gold, clothes, perfume, spices, horses, and mules, which mules were especially valuable. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses, 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. So here we have great wealth has been described, and now we're just describing this great military might that he has acquired. He kept them in assigned cities in Jerusalem. The king made silver as plentiful in Jerusalem as stones. Cedar was as plentiful as sycamore. Fig trees on the foot are as plentiful as the sycamore fig trees are on the foothills. Solomon acquired his horses from Egypt and from Kew. The king's traders purchased them from Kew. They paid 600 silver pieces for each chariot from Egypt and 150 pieces for each horse. They also sold chariots and horses to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of Syria.
I'm sorry, where are we?
We are fixing to start in chapter 11 of 1 Kings.
Okay, thank you.
So Solomon's using his wealth not only to build his own military, but he's got a military complex going on here where, since he's the richest kingdom in the known world, he's facilitating this buying and trading between nations to build their militaries, and he's making money. So he's the middleman because he's got all the money. And so this is what's going on, and that we can't just run past it because God has already warned not to do this. He warns about this in Deuteronomy. 3 times a year, Solomon goes to the temple and he offers these fellowship offerings with God. And during that, every time that would be done, the law was read. That was part of the ceremony. And so he heard the law 3 times a year. So he couldn't escape. He couldn't say, I didn't know. I've got an excuse here. Plus, you can't do that and also claim to be the wisest man in the world, which was God given to you as well. So there's these things that always seem to pop up where, God's present in all that he's doing in the life of Solomon and in the life of Israel. But then there's always this little undercurrent that's going on. But you shouldn't be doing that because that's going to come back to get you. So it says to us again that God is extravagant in the way that he provides as long as we're going along with what he wants. And rightfully so, because God, it's all his anyway. And what he has designed for life is his design. The way that he has chosen to relate to his people is his design. And Solomon's accomplishing most all of it, except for these places where it seems like our human nature just always seems to creep in. If I can have wealth, why not have it? If I can have my own security, why not have it? And here, if I can have my own pleasure, then why not have it? That's the next thing in chapter 11. So King Solomon fell in love with many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, included Moabites, Amorites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites. They came from nations about which the Lord had warned the Israelites. You must not establish friendly relations with them. Let's see what that is. It doesn't give me a cross-reference. It actually says you must not go into them, and they must not go into you. So he's talking about sex. I said it. It's still okay to say it. Okay? So you must not establish friendly relations with them. If you do, they will surely shift your allegiance to their gods. But Solomon was irresistibly attracted to them. So you remember the story about Achilles, and he was this great and mighty warrior, and he could fight 10,000 men and all this. But we all know what the Achilles tendon is. The story is he's fighting, and he gets an arrow through his tendon on his foot, and he can no longer fight. He's just helpless. Can't be who he was because of this small little thing, the small little bit of biology. And so Solomon's suffering from the same thing. It's a small little bit of biology that causes him to lose his wisdom, really, truly. Because the law of God is wise. But he cannot seem to resist. It says it was irresistibly attracted to these women. The Hebrew says Solomon clung to them for love. The pronominal suffix translated them is masculine here, even though it appears that the foreign women are in view, which there's some inconsistencies with the language. So that's been suggested, of course. Well, he was gay. So that was some of the wives are just being They're being friendly with the word wives, but the pronouns, if you read between the lines. But that's not the case. You can use the masculine in other ways in pronominal use. So if you ever read that, that's where that comes from. A pronoun that's in the wrong place. He had 700 royal wives. These mean that these were the ones that had gone under ceremony with him to be a wife. So you've and then had 300 concubines. So you remember recently in Thailand there was a big hoopla about this because they had the big ceremony installing the official concubine for the king of Thailand. Do y'all remember seeing this on the news? Because they still do that in Thailand. You have the queen, and then you have an official concubine. And there was a big ceremony for that, and the queen is there, and it's all a part of their tradition. They don't think anything weird or wrong or sinful about it, of course. And so Solomon had gone through 700 weddings, and he had gone through 300 of these ceremonial concubine things to make them official. His wives had a powerful influence on him. Okay, the wives bent his heart is the way that the Hebrew would read there. So what they're describing is he had this heart turned to God, and now it's been twisted and turned away from God and turned to whatever they want. When Solomon became old, his wives shifted his allegiance to other gods. He was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his father David had been. So you remember the thing about David's integrity and sincerity? He wasn't a perfect man. He sinned. His sins brought all kind of trouble. But his relationship with God, his devotion to God was unyielding. Even in the midst of all of that. Even to the point where David probably got depressed about some of the things that he had done. But God brought him out of that. And just on and on, you could see God working in restoring and honoring David. So Solomon worshipped the Sidonian goddess Ashtare and the detestable Ammonite god Milcom. Solomon did evil in the Lord's sight. This is the first time you hear this word evil directed toward the king of any king, David or Saul. He doesn't use that language until now. He did not remain loyal, and that word is the same root word for hesed. He did not have loyal love to God, as God had shown loyal love to him. He was not loyal to the Lord as his father David had. Furthermore, on the hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for the detestable Moabite god Chemosh, and for the detestable Amorite god Milcom. He built high places for all his foreign wives so that they could burn incense and make sacrifices to their gods. So remember, at the beginning, there were these high places everywhere because there was no temple in which to worship God. So God was patient, and he allowed for his people to worship anywhere that they could find to worship. But after the temple was built, he said, and Solomon said, this will be the only place we worship. Okay? But as soon as he started worshiping other gods, well, he couldn't do that in the place where God's name was. So he started setting up these other little places. What hill is east of Jerusalem? Anybody know? Look it up. Anyway, he sets up these high places, these poles. They would just stand up a pole. Probably had some carving on it like you've seen totem poles. And they would worship that. Nutty. As nutty as it can be. So, the Lord was angry with Solomon because he had shifted his allegiance away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him on 2 occasions and had warned him about this very thing, so that he would not follow other gods. Remember, back in chapter 10, God goes through this whole thing. Appears a second time. The first time it was the same thing. I'm going to bless you, but you got to follow me. 17 years. Solomon's building the temple. He's building the palace. He's doing everything. And then after that, and he dedicates the temple, God says, I'm going to bless you, but you got to keep following me. And now he's not following him. He's not committed to him. He's not loyal to him. But he did not obey the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you insist on doing these things and have not kept the covenantal rules I gave you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. However, for your father David's sake, I will not do this while you are alive. I will tear it away from your son's hand instead. But I will not tear away the entire kingdom. I will leave your son one tribe for my servant David's sake and for the sake of my chosen city, Jerusalem. So there you go. All right. So now we have the preliminary prophecy by God of what's about to happen. After Solomon dies, Jeroboam and Rehoboam have a fight over the kingdom. The son, Rehoboam, gets to keep the southern tribe and half tribe, and everything else goes to the servant, just like God says. And all this happens after Solomon dies. Okay? So, some will say that all of this was written after the exile, that we're projecting back what we know onto an ancient writing or onto a writing that is a historical record. And so it's not really prophecy. It doesn't really matter how it comes about and what is said first and occurs second. From the very beginning, God has set forth his will to do whatever he's going to do with his people. And so ultimately that is the end that occurs. There's a divided kingdom that ultimately goes into exile. Then verse 14, the Lord brought against Solomon an enemy, Hadad the Edomite, a descendant of the Edomite king. During David's campaign against Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, while on a mission to bury the dead, killed every male in Edom. For Joab and the entire Israelite army stayed there 6 months until they had exterminated every male in Edom. Hadad, who was only a small boy at the time, escaped with some of his father's Edomite servants and headed for Egypt. Isn't it interesting that every time there needs to be an escape, it always winds up in Egypt? It's the place of refuge and it's the place of slavery.
There's a lot of killing going on.
A lot of killing going on. Yeah, we have an entirely different view of killing than they did in the Old Testament. Killing was a part of it was a part of that security that we keep talking about, where we try to maintain our own security. God says you don't kill, but we kill. Okay, and there's been times when God allows it because it meets a purpose that He has in punishment that He's putting upon a people, but at other times He doesn't. So this is one of those times where Joab, if you remember Joab, he was a bloodthirsty dude. And he spent 6 months exterminating the people that God never commanded to exterminate. They went from Midian to Paran. They took some of the men from Paran and went to Egypt. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, gave him a house and some land and supplied him with food. Pharaoh liked Hadad so well, he gave him his sister-in-law. He did a lot of that too, as a wife, Queen Tahpenes. Queen Tahpenes' sister as his wife. Tahpenes' sister gave birth to his son named Gehubath. Tahpenes raised him in Pharaoh's palace,
Gehubath grew up in Pharaoh's palace among Pharaoh's sons. While in Egypt, Hadad heard that David had passed away and that Joab was commander of the army was dead. So Hadad asked Pharaoh, "Give me permission to leave so I can return to my homeland." Pharaoh said to him, "What do you lack here that makes you want to go to your homeland?" And Hadad replied, "Nothing, but please give me permission to leave." So here we have it's almost a parallel of the Moses story, right? He's brought up there. He lives in Pharaoh's house, and he wants to leave to go accomplish something. Pharaoh wanted to leave with all his people. Moses wanted to leave with all his people. Pharaoh resisted. And now Hadad wants to leave, but for an entirely different reason. He doesn't want to save those people. He wants to get revenge on them for what Joab had done. God also brought against Solomon another enemy, Rezon, son of Elidah, who had run away from his master king Hadaezer of Zobath. He gathered some men and organized a raiding party. When David tried to kill him, they went to Damascus. When they settled down and gained control of the city, he was Israel's enemy throughout Solomon's reign, and like Hadad, caused trouble. He loathed Israel and ruled over Syria. So remember, God said there's going to be a time of peace. Neither one of these enemies had much strength to do anything while Solomon was around. They were like a nuisance. They were just it's like the kid on the playground that wants to be the bully, but he's 4'8".
Yeah.
Okay, it's kind of like that. If you've ever seen Spaceballs, anybody seen Spaceballs?
Yeah.
where Bill Pullman's got Rick Moranis by the head and he's swinging it. Okay, that's the picture I get. Yeah, Bible teaching according to Spaceballs. You won't get that anywhere else. Okay. So Jeroboam, son of Nebat, one of Solomon's servants, rebelled against the king. So here we have another. He was an Ephraimite from Zeradah, whose mother was a widow named Zerurah. This is what prompted him to rebel against the king. And here's the story. Solomon built a terrace, and he closed up a gap in the wall of the city of his father David. Jeroboam was a talented man. When Solomon saw that the young man who was an accomplished worker had made him the leader of the work crew for the tribe of Joseph. At that time, when Jeroboam had left Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the road. The two of them were alone in the open country. Ahijah was wearing a brand new robe, and he grabbed the robe and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he told Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces from this, for this is what the Lord God of Israel said. Look, I'm about to tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand, and I will give 10 tribes to you. He will retain 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." So here the prophecy that God has given to Solomon is being spoken again to one of Solomon's enemies. And so it's going to belong to someone else. I am taking the kingdom from him because they have abandoned me and worshipped the Sidonian goddess. Here is that David's line, David's kingship, David's dynasty, I am not taking away. I'm holding on to that because of David's integrity and sincerity of heart. And of course that gets carried on into the New Testament. Verse 37. I will select you. You will rule over all your desire to have, and you will be king over Israel. You must obey all I command you to do, follow my instructions, do what I approve, and keep my rules and commandments, as my servant David did. Then I will be with you and establish for you a lasting dynasty, as I did David. So he's talking about this northern kingdom is going to continue, but not forever. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam escaped to Egypt and found refuge with King Shishak of Egypt. He stayed in Egypt until Solomon died. So before Solomon ever dies, there's this
God's putting into place all that He needs and all that He wants to bring Solomon's rule to an end. And why? Because Solomon
Horses and women.
and lots of stuff. Yeah. Solomon was becoming like one of the other gods. Yeah. Like what?
American.
Like an American?
He was
Yeah.
so big for his boots.
Well, when you worship the other gods that they worshipped, I'm sure were self-sustaining gods, right? They didn't need anything. They didn't want anything. They were just wanted to be adulation and worship, whatever that brought to the worshiper, it brought. And Solomon's in that kind of same thing now, where he's kind of like one of them. It never does say that he worships. It says his wives worship, and it does say the first one that he worshipped. But he led the people to worship. So we'll go all the way back to Samuel and Saul, when the people started asking for a king, and God said, "The man that I choose is going to be a savior for my people. They're going to bring my people to me. He's going to be a priest. He's going to be a king, and he's going to be a priest." And Saul started out good, and he did that. David did that. Solomon was doing that. Built the grandest temple that could ever be imagined to a person's God, the one true God. And then he just kind of, I'm just going to do what my wives tell me to do. I'm not going to do what God tells me to do. Does that sound crazy? It sounds like American. We just kind of, we don't treat God with the reverence, the sincerity and loyalty that He really deserves. We wind up having to pay the price. Now we understand His mercy more because Christ has come. We also understand His anger a little more because He killed His own Son in order to save us. And what brought that about was our own sin. So there's some more things that we understand about how He operates in the world when we choose not to. There's other layers to God that are not revealed here that we get to see later. So, the rest of the events of Solomon's reign, including all his accomplishments and his wise decisions, are recorded in the scroll called the Annals of Solomon. Imagine that. Solomon ruled over all Israel from Jerusalem for 40 years. Then Solomon passed away and was buried in the city of his father David. His son Rehoboam replaced him as king. And that's as far as we'll get this week. But so when you hear that they ruled 40 years, a lot of kings rule 40 years. So you begin to wonder, what's that number mean? Well, that's just a complete period of time. It's the time that was required to bring about whatever ends. So there was a period of time required for Solomon to be king, and then he died. There were 40 years in the wilderness because there was a required amount of time needed for God to do what He was doing, to accomplish His end, to bring him into the promised land. Doesn't necessarily mean it's an exact 40 years. Anyway, was any of that helpful? Any questions or comments about any of that? Do you find it frustrating that we give people like Solomon in the Bible such adulation and lift them up, and then we find out that so much about their life they're just kind of like us in a lot of ways? What?
Wouldn't you think He would forget some of them and then accidentally marry them again?
Yeah. Oh man, I like her. I want to marry her. And somebody has to say, "That's your wife." I hate to say it this way, that they probably were tagged.
You think so? Yeah.
I'm sure that they had something that they wore that said, "Oh, that's a wife," or "That's a royal
That's a concubine.
somebody," and then
I just can't see somebody with that many wives.
Just why? Just because you can say.
because he found them irresistible.
Yeah.
So what does it illustrate? It illustrates that you reach a point where you can have anything and everything, so you want everything. I mean, why does a man need a $700 million yacht? Why?
Because he's greedy.
Because he can have it. I don't know if money means anything at that point when you can look at a big hunk of boat and say,
That's fine.
$700 million. Let's
Yeah.
That's
try that out for a while. You know, because if he ever decides to sell the $700 million yacht, he may only get $300 million because how many people can afford a $700 million? They
It's
don't
like,
want it.
what's her name? That woman that was head of education. What was her name?
Oh, DeVos.
Yes, she had 11 yachts.
Yeah.
11.
But then you got people like,
That's great.
you have people like Elon Musk who makes $16 million an hour.
But
So in the time that I've been awake today, he's made almost $180 million. So I just try to get my head around that and think, well, money doesn't really mean much to him. Can't really mean anything like it means to 99.999% of the planet. So after a while, you do feel like you can just do whatever you want and be whatever you want. I mean, here's a man that wants to go to Mars, and he's going to Mars one day. I mean, probably in time for me to see it. Okay, so that was Solomon. Money didn't mean anything, really. I mean, silver was like rocks on the ground. Chariots, he had enough chariots to where he was buying and selling them to what was ultimately going to be his enemies here, not too very long, for his sons. So really that military thing, that was more of a play toy than it was anything. And then the women were kind of the same thing. He just didn't have any meaning left to him. So having more really was as good as having less. So why not have more? And we see that kind of degradation in our country, and there's a segment that says, "Oh, that's the American dream," and then there's those of us that say we just want to be free. Well, that's the American dream, just to be free, or to just be happy with my family, or whatever it is. But the worst part about it for Solomon is that he led the nation into this, because as the king went, the nation went. And so God is angry at Solomon for what he's done, because his heart's no longer turned to him, it's bent to these other idols. But worse than that is he's led the people into this as well. And look what God's already done to make this small, insignificant people a great people, because he just chose them. Then when we get further into it, we'll see that you'll have one king that'll be really good, and things will be good. And you have another king that's really bad, and things will be bad, and they make stupid decisions, and the military might that's in the region begins to figure out, hey, we can take this place without much problem because their leaders are indecisive and they don't have the respect of the people. And so things begin to happen. And God let them happen because it was part of what he was doing to correct the problem of the heart. He had to let all of that work through their system so that they could finally come to their senses and say, we'll return. And God says, if you seek me, I will be found. It's up to you to seek me out. And for a good period of time there, that's not what the king was doing. And so the country was left in peril. That's why we put our trust in our king. Only our king is perfect. He's not going to lead us astray. He's always going to have his heart turned to God because he is God. And so this whole idea of kingship matters as we move through, because ultimately it points to our king and why that matters to us. Yes, ma'am.
yeah, I have a question about verse 27. When it's talking about this is what prompted Jeroboam to rebel against the king. It says Solomon built a terrace and he closed up a gap in the wall of the city of his father David. And I don't understand why that would make him.
Because Jeroboam was a talented craftsman and he didn't do it. So it's petty. It's petty. Now this gap in the terrace, they're called milos, and they were actually for fortification to keep the enemy out. So you hear about when they would put siege works against the city, and we'll read about that coming up, where they would move, I mean literally mountains of dirt to where the opposing army could just walk right up. Well, the terrace or the milos that were built on the inside of the wall were a place where the defending army could stand, and they had a high position to work from, and they didn't have to climb up and down a wall. They could run up and down and, fortify the positions and all of that. So there was a gap in that, and Jeroboam, who was talented and skilled at doing that, was not asked. And so it gives the only thing it gives hint to is that there was conflict between Jeroboam and Solomon, and Jeroboam took it quite seriously. And
So God takes most of Israel away from the son of David and gives it to this petty construction worker who got jealous.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just making sure I got that right.
There's a method
Now
to
he's
the
not
madness.
he's not King Long.
And also, it says that he got 10 pieces, and then the one tribe was still with Rehoboam, but where's the...
Well, there's the half tribe,
Okay.
and one half tribe winds up with Judah, and the other half tribe goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Complicated.
Yeah, so that's one of those priestly writing things where they get the record kind of wrong because they're only wanting to talk about the whole tribes and not the half tribes. So there were parts of the priestly tradition that didn't recognize the 12th tribe. So they probably wrote that.
When did Palestine ever come in?
Well, Palestine is just a geographic name. Okay, it's not a people. That's something that the UN made up in the 1950s. So the Palestine was just a geographic area identified much later by that name,
Okay.
and it's I don't even know where it gets its etymology as to why it was called Palestine. But foreigners called it Palestine before the people living there did. So it's kind of like a name on a map. Yeah, the Palestinian people, there wasn't really a people called Palestinians until the whole accord where Israel got Israel back, and they made a place called Palestine because there was some displacement of population. Yeah. But it is an ancient word. Of course, it appears in the Bible. What else?
How can I prove to my son that Armageddon has not already happened?
Wait, this son? Oh, that son.
No, he says
Ugh.
there's two gods in the Bible. The Old Testament, he was a fake God, and then after Jesus came, that's the real God, and everything's already happened.